about the significance of the Zeus story by Edward Albee. And I think we should start off with our individual themes. Reverend Kay?
So, through an archetypal or spiritual lens, I think that Edward Albee is explaining that we create our own God because humans have an innate desire to determine and understand the meaning of life and why things happen. And to avoid the anxiety and fear that comes with the unknowing answers of these questions, we create a God as an explanation.
Contrary to that, I think through a genderqueer theory that sexuality is actually identity. And so whatever society's norm of sexuality is, you have to conform to it, otherwise your identity would be abrupt.
Looking at the Edward Albee's The Zeus Story through a Freudian lens, it suggests that repression of desires influences humans to think and act irrationally.
In my opinion, from a feminist lens, the Zeus story is saying that society establishes specific gender roles that create isolation if one does not conform. So let's bring up a topic. Let's talk about the colored queen. Reverend Kay, what do you think about that?
So, I think the colored queen is kind of mocking a spiritual connection because there is no proof of God or spirits or non-earthly beings. And the colored queen's relationship with Jerry and the other occupants in their apartment building seem weak because he doesn't really have an interaction with anybody. He never has anyone in his apartment. I think this illustrates how God doesn't really care, and even if there is one, we're still alone because he's not listening.
Going off of that though, I just think that since he stays in the apartment, it's how he's staying behind bars in a zoo, which was referenced on page 40. And so he's seen as an animal from only going to the bathroom or staying in his room, and this is because of the opposing society against gays, which he feels like he's being treated like an animal, and that's all he does is go to the bathroom. He has rotten teeth, and he's not actually seen as a human.
From a Freudian lens, I think that Jerry, who is kind of referring to the colored queen as a god, which is usually considered someone we look up to, someone we go to for protection. And so I think he's been repressing his desires of actually becoming someone like the colored queen, who is a transgender, because he's always going to the pretty little ladies for pleasure instead of boys who he's actually found relationships of love with. So I think he kind of looks up to the colored queen and desires to be like him, but because he's scared of what society would think, he acts irrationally and represses his desires, which makes him run to pretty little ladies even though that's not what he truly wants.
That was all interesting conversation, but in my opinion, from a feminist lens, the pornographic playing cards have a very specific role. On page 10, it explains that Jerry feels his isolation from male sexuality because as a child, the cards allow Jerry to imagine becoming an ideal man with beautiful women always surrounding him. But now these cards are a constant reminder of what he can't have because he refuses to conform to the masculinity that society pressures onto men. Anyone else have any thoughts?
So based off of queer theory, these pornographic playing cards, on page 25, Jerry is talking about how he's gay here, but speaks in a weird attitude, he rushes through his speech. So he's saying this, that he only made love once, but it was with a boy. So then he tries to be interested in girls, but only for since society's norms is for a straight sexuality. So then on page 26, when they were actually talking about these pornographic playing cards, Peter was experienced, at the bottom of page 26, he says that he was experienced because he has a wife, but Jerry has never had a real experience since the only love he has had is with a boy. And also on page 27, the difference between the pornographic playing cards of when the use of it when he's a kid and when he's an adult, it shows that Jerry has never conformed to his sexual identity and has never accepted it based off of society.
I think that the playing cards have little significance in the archetypal lens, and I think that the death is more important because Jerry sacrificed himself to Peter, and I think that's because Peter is like the figure of God to Jerry, and Peter listened to Jerry's story about what happened at the zoo and his dog story and all of his other stories. And this is symbolic of God listening to all his children, because God, we're supposed to listen to you like no matter what you've done. And Peter stayed and listened to Jerry no matter what he said. So I think that Peter was taking away Jerry's suffering, and like it was more of a washing of his sins.
I would also like to add that during Jerry's death scene on page 48, he says to Peter, "I came unto you, and you have comforted me, dear Peter." This quote is an allusion to the Bible in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, that refer to Paul asking for God's wisdom. This allusion demonstrates Jerry thanking Peter for listening to his stories, which serve as confessions in a symbolic sense to the archetypal or spiritual lens, and for helping him die. This allusion represents Jerry's creation of a God through the form of Peter to help him understand himself and to explain and rationalize his decisions. Jerry and humans in general will truly never know who is in control of our lives and why anything happens. So we have a tendency to confide in a God figure. And humans don't want to accept that we might truly be alone because it is too scary or overwhelming.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point, but from a feminist perspective, I think that Jerry's death was kind of an escape from human isolation caused by society's prevailing gender roles and expectations. Jerry's world is like a zoo, which is why the story is called the Zoo Story, and where he feels trapped and behind bars like animals, separated from everyone, and where men are separated from their own basic animal nature. He walked into the knife so he could finally tell his zoo story and why he never conformed to society's gender roles like Peter has. Any other viewpoints?
Through a Freudian lens, I believe that the death is significant because all of Jerry's life he's been repressing his desires to be sexually active with men, and then this repression has led to depression because he's constantly pushing down his desires into an unconscious world, and this depression has led to attempts of suicide. So he walks up to Peter a random day and then hands him a knife and impales himself against Peter and the knife, which is, I think, a significant part of the play because it definitely shows that he's wanted to commit suicide.
I think the absurdity of Jerry's death is more significant in that Peter, like Jerry wants Peter never to forget, and I think that is symbolic of Jerry's way of searching for and receiving an eternal life or salvation.
I don't know if we're ever going to agree on the theme.
Well, I believe that Jerry has mostly been impacted by irrational thoughts and acted upon them.
I believe that Jerry has mostly just been on a search for salvation, and his death allowed him to receive that.
Well, I think you're all incorrect. I'm correct here.